Hello, everybody. My name is Joel Murphy. And welcome to another Red Sofa Conversation. Today, we're joined by Sanjana Daniel. She works for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship of Canada, has done so for the past 8 years, 6 as a campus minister, and then 2 most recently at their national office in Toronto as the digital ministry specialist. Mm-hmm. Welcome here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's nice to be back in the Atlantic.
Yes, we're glad to have you. Yeah. What does that mean, digital ministry specialist, as well as feel free to introduce yourself more if you want to.
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. As the digital ministry specialist, I'm working with the communications team at InterVarsity, and we're trying to answer essentially 2 key questions. So one of them is maybe the more expected one of how do we as InterVarsity, as a youth and young adult ministry, find our voice in digital space? How do we use digital tools as effective discipleship tools? But the other side of the question I think we actually spend more time on is around how do we disciple young people well for the realities of a digital era? So we're in this time when culture is being broadly shaped by our interactions with and through digital technology. Right. And that has particular implications for how culture develops and for how children and young people develop and how faith develops. So what does it look like to help youth and young adults understand spiritual formation through the lens of current culture, and how is digital technology incorporated into that?
Oh, that's so, yes. So we're going to talk, I'm excited to jump into that.
Yeah.
Maybe if people aren't familiar with InterVarsity, could you give a little bit of a kind of introduction to what the organization does and is?
Sure.
And
Yeah, so InterVarsity started as a campus ministry. It was planted out of the UK by a man named Howard Guinness. And so there's some really interesting history there that you're welcome to look into if you're interested. I won't do it justice, so I won't go into it. But at this point, we have campus groups that are focused on living missionally in their context at universities across Canada. We also have summer camps. I think we have 9 summer camps across the country. That sounds right. Yeah. Where we minister to particularly 6 to 16-year-olds through the summer, but it's also a really great place for 16 to 25-year-olds to come and work as sometimes year-round staff, but often summer staff. Yeah. Then we have 2 kind of other branches to our ministry. One is high school ministry, which I know you're familiar with, where we have, it's similar to our campus ministry, but in the high school context. And then we've just launched a workplace ministry, which kind of came out of some of the findings in the hemorrhaging faith study from a handful of years ago, where we were noticing that the place that the church loses a lot of people is in transitions. Yeah. And that transition from university into the workplace is a particularly difficult one. And we were noticing in InterVarsity that's where a lot of people who would come through InterVarsity would fall away or, get lost a little bit or just wind up with an experience of Christianity and experience of the church that didn't match what they'd come to expect. And then would kind of find themselves disillusioned or what have you, and not having the same level of community to kind of walk through some of those discernment and deconstruction processes with. And then, that gets a little bit messy. And people have a tendency to fall away. So in our workplace ministry, we're trying to help young people, first of all, learn how to function outside of school. You spend the first you spend the first 21 years of your life or 25 or whatever if you go into masters and postdoc and stuff, and then all of a sudden that's not a structure that you have to help guide your community or your decision making, and then also to kind of integrate theology and work. So how does your understanding of who God is impact how you do your job in your career field?
Yes.
So those are kind of main pieces that InterVarsity is doing.
I think it's helpful. I think it's like the context that like the work you're doing is that space of kind of innovation with younger people and like recognition of, like I think you said earlier, the digital age that we're in and how things are changing. And so like theology in the workplace, like how do you do that well? It all seems to fit. In your experience, like obviously working with young people, but as well as in your role, like how are you seeing technology continue? Obviously we know that we're in the midst of Amy Webb's, who's a futurist, talks about a super cycle of technology that is just like with the like kind of three pieces that are happening with our AI and wearables and biotech, that we're in the midst of this big thing that's happening and it's changing our world.
Totally.
How have you seen technology shift and change in your own ministry as you were working on campus, working with young people, as well as in your new role?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's loads of ways that technology is impacting what we do, right? And some of them are really good. Like, I actually think being able to like automate our financial processes, HR systems, like that stuff is great. Being able on the communications side to use AI as a basis for copywriting is incredible, especially when you're a not-for-profit organization and you're working on very lean margins and often understaffed, don't have manpower. Being able to utilize some of these tools in a way that frees you up to not just do kind of the grind work is super helpful. And I think we're still kind of growing into that capacity a bit. We definitely don't have that on lock in university, but there's a lot of opportunity there, and we're kind of growing into some of that. As far as working with students goes, I think I experienced a shift in how technology affects us the most when I was on campus, particularly during COVID, which I think is when a lot of us experienced our relationship to technology change. I don't think that technology caused as much of the shift as we might experience it to. I think we talk about it in a very accusative way. But, there was a global pandemic. Technology didn't cause that.
Right, yes.
But I think our access to technology at that time really changed the way that we experienced the pandemic. And I think that our relationship to technology really changed because of the pandemic. Or not changed, but maybe was catalyzed, actually. Yeah, so like one of the stats that I'll often talk about with people is in 2021, the American Medical Association released a study in their Journal of Pediatrics that showed that American youth between 13 and 15 experienced an increase in their recreational screen time from about 3.4 hours per day to like 7.8 hours per day.
So increase of 4 hours.
Yeah, basically doubled, right?
Right, yeah.
And that was just recreational screen time. So that actually didn't include online learning, which it was already a good chunk of their day.
You're right.
Right. So most of their waking hours are spent on some sort of a screen.
Right.
Now that has shifted a little bit since we've come out of lockdown, but it hasn't gone back to kind of pre-lockdown numbers. So there's definitely something to consider around. I mean, I think the first thing that people think about is usually like, what are kids consuming,
right,
or what are they doing? What are they experiencing on there? And I think it's interesting to see how there's definitely high consumption numbers, but there's also really high numbers of people who are using that time in more creative and connective ways. So a lot of kids spend time gaming,
right,
and in gaming communities, and that's a huge that actually accounts for a huge proportion of those numbers that we're seeing.
And so like so many, it's so interesting, right? Like even thinking about like the gaming or the connection piece, like how, like what is that idea of like, or what have kind of, as you did in your own research or in the work you're doing, like thinking about like that idea of connection being in online spaces, the implications of that for, I guess, like communities of faith or faith formation, or like, I mean, I know you've been doing a lot of work around digital discipleship. So like, how does that, as we think about the fact that people are in these spaces and we're wanting to invest in them spiritually and help their spiritual formation and get closer to Jesus, how do you navigate, how can ministries navigate that, or in your own work, like how are you approaching it to be able to do it well, I suppose? Because we can't just ignore it. I think that seems to be, because if we're ignoring it, if they're spending 7 hours in this space, it's like we're choosing then not to be there. And that seems like an intentional choice to not engage in spiritual formation, which doesn't seem like a good option.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and I think like the church's most common reaction is to just disengage, is to pull back, and is to place that on young people as well, and say like, this should be your response, is to just like get off. Right. And I think that's a very natural reaction. We're like, 8 hours on a screen, that's crazy. Right. I mean, most of us probably also spend 8 hours of our day.
And it's probably not good. Like I think I think the reality is like, it doesn't, acknowledging that this is what's happening isn't like an affirmation of this is what's this is what we need to do.
Sure.
It seems to be like an acknowledgement and an awareness of this is the space. How do we, if this is what's happening, how do we then engage with it wisely and not...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so those are exactly like the two kind of pillar principles that I talk about with digital discipleship, is to disengage regularly. I think that is important. I think we instinctively move to that piece because it's good. Right. But it can't be the only thing. It can't be our only response, just like you're saying. So the other piece is to engage well. And when we talk about engaging well, one of the things that I've been talking with people about lately is sort of the idea of fasting. A lot of people are like starting to consider taking tech fasts and stuff like that in their lives. But we'll often approach that from this perspective of like, just, I don't know how to put it, but like restricting access to this thing and then kind of hoping that restriction holds when we go back. But it often doesn't, because we're putting it aside as if it's like a bad thing that we're taking a break from, and then like wind up kind of indulging in it. It's like a diet. It's more than a fast. Whereas like the Christian principle of fasting is to give up something good for something better. So actually in that you have to acknowledge that the thing you're giving up is good. It's not a bad thing inherently in and of itself. And then when we come back to it, the hope is that actually our time with God has changed the way that we interact with the good thing. So that's particularly when I'm talking to like people who are leading youth and young adults. Like this is something that I will talk to them about, because I think it takes some work for us to shift our perspective from just viewing tech and the digital world and social media and all these spaces as inherently bad, to a tool that gets used maliciously often 100%. In the world, as does everything that's left to the world to use, but that actually has redemptive potential. Like I really believe that Jesus wants to redeem all of creation, and I think that holds for the digital world as well. There's like that Kuyper quote that's very famous, where I'm like, there's not 1 square inch in all of creation over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not shout mine. I'm sure I butchered that, but so you get the gist. You get the gist of it. And I think Jesus wants to do that in digital spaces as well, and cry like, this is mine, over it. And so like, what does it look like to invite young people in particular, but also for ourselves, to consider how are we vessels of that when we are watching YouTube or on Instagram, or when we're in a gaming community? How are we acting as vessels for Christ to claim ownership and sovereignty over these spaces?
I feel like the idea of like claiming sovereignty is an interesting, I love that. And it gives us like a sense of agency, and that like recognition that the Holy Spirit is present and can be active in an online game.
Yeah.
And then like the Holy Spirit can still be used through whatever social media it can move across.
Right.
Which is like, I think, values the efficacy of the Spirit, which is good. Where is, we didn't talk about this to talk about, but like, I feel like there also, where does mourning come in terms of like engagement with social or like with the digital space?
Yeah. And
like, how do we maybe mourn? Like, I think there's an element of like, there's a loss of what was.
Sure.
But then also being able to, and there are some negative pieces, and we know that.
Yeah.
But like that, but then couple that mourning with like the intentionality that you've been talking about, with the acknowledgement that like the sovereignty of God is still there.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because this is something that I've been realizing as I've been able to take some of this stuff, like our workshops and things, more out into the world and actually use these resources with particularly younger people, especially people in the sort of 17 to 24 crowd. I think, like, okay, we're both millennials.
Yeah.
We're probably the last generation to really feel this dissonance between what was and what is.
Oh, yes.
Because the reality is, for digital natives whose, primary formative years have happened since the introduction of the smartphone, there wasn't a before. So they don't feel the loss in the way that we do.
Right.
So I think, yeah, definitely, like, we feel a loss. We probably do need to lament in some ways what was, but also acknowledge the fact that this just is reality. We can't place our grief on a generation that doesn't feel it. That's really unfair. And I don't think it actually serves them or helps them to live their lives in the time and place that God has placed them.
Right. In
a way that is good or honoring of Jesus.
Yeah. I just feel like there's something there around, it's an acknowledgement of what's people's current experience. And then it's an acknowledgement of like, okay, this is where we're coming from. And like, I know like my great grandma, like, it was a big deal when she got her, my uncle got her an iPad, and so I could text with her. Yeah. Which is remarkable. Totally. So we can, instead of getting like long letters in the mail, I get long text messages. Which is great. But I can also reply, and I can send her pictures of like my daughter and so she loves that. So I know that it's a hard tension when thinking about the way that things the way that were, and like where you would be talking on the phone or be in person, and there's a loss there. But I think it's an interesting distinction around younger people don't have that sense of loss because they've always had a phone. Like my daughter this morning, for better or for worse, was saying, "Hey Google, play some sort of Cocomelon song, or Daniel the Tiger." And so like it's like she knows that's the experience, and she's Generation Alpha, and like they're going to be. I read one book that was talking about like they're going to be familiar with the voices of Siri. And then for me, what I think about then is, okay, if people are in leadership and they maybe they're wanting to reach young people, they're wanting to engage in digital discipleship, they're wanting to engage in digital space, and inviting people to have maybe step out of it in some degree. People don't know what that means, or a lot of young people don't know what that means. Right. So then if you're thinking about, and I know you do this in your workshops, like if you're then to speak to a leader who's like older and more mature, like how would you go about, or even yourself working with students, how would you go about inviting them into spaces that aren't digital? Right. Yeah. Yeah. You mean because their motivation for stepping into that isn't rooted in nostalgia? Yeah, because this is just the world they're living in. Like, like you mean I could talk to people like in my neighborhood or like down the street, like, and not in my online gaming community, even though that's real and good. Yeah. How do you because we know, I think the idea of being an embodied faith, being present in our community, like that's an important part that is, I think, like that's how do we hold that? Because there is something about bringing God in your neighborhoods. Yeah. How do you even start the conversation potentially with a young person to be able to invite them into that more embodied space? Totally. That's a great question. So in terms of feasting and fasting, I think this one is particularly important for leaders. So this is what I was talking about before, where
when we're encouraging people to come away, say like on retreat or to go to summer camp or just to include the removal of tech as part of your Sabbath practice, thinking about the purpose of that not just being to take a break,
right,
or to get away from something that's evil. Like really that's just a lack of repentance, right? If you're like, let me take a break from this evil thing and then go back to it,
right.
that's not really fasting. So changing our perspective to think about, how does rest from this way of doing life, first of all, glorify God. Second of all, provide us a way of engaging with God such that when we go back, actually our way of doing life in that space is changed.
Right.
And I think like the benefit of age and of having experiences in other eras is that we can offer the wisdom of experience,
right,
to people who are younger, and show them like a winsome version of life that isn't completely bound up with technology. And I think a lot of them actually respond really well to that. Sometimes it is foreign.
Yeah.
So we get a lot of kids who like, especially who are working at camp, who, they have to put their phones away. They're not allowed to use them at camp, partly because we don't want to be responsible for you destroying your $300 device and dropping it in the lake or whatever. But also partly because actually, if your summer staff, for example, like to be a responsible leader, you need to be fully present with the kids that you're working with. And many of them after that experience, like you'll see they don't use their phones as often in break times as they did before, because they're wrapped up in the experience that they're currently living.
Right.
I think that's just true in life, is you get wrapped up in the experience that you're currently living. So in our normal day-to-day life, that includes smartphones, that includes tablets, that includes video games. So it's not that setting limits is bad, but I think helping them understand why we set the limit, and then also following that ourselves.
Right.
So, how many times am I at my mom's house? My mom is 74, and she has the TV on, because like maybe we're watching HGTV or whatever, and she's also on her phone looking at like videos on Facebook or whatever. Yeah. And so then when I try to talk to her about what I'm seeing on the screen that we're supposed to be interacting with together, she's actually not there. Right. She's in her own world on her pocket device. Right, that's not to call out my mom. No. But like, I think we do this often. We have multiple screens in front of us. What does it look like to strip back to one? Just focus on one thing at a time. Right. Or like, how often when you are meeting with a person, do you have your Apple Watch on, or have your phone out on the table just in case someone needs to reach you? Right. Well, what does it look like to be unreachable sometimes? Right. And put your phone away and say like, no, kids, if you want to call me because, I don't know, you forgot something at home, like tough. Right. I'm with people, so I'm not going to be responding to you at this point, right? And for that not to be like, oh, because I don't like being reachable, right, but because there's something else that we're valuing more in that choice. Right. So that would be kind of the feast and fast, right? Which I suppose like the feasting is not really like then go back and
just
like,
gorge yourself.
Just shove your face on stuff.
5 different streams.
Exactly. But allow yourself to indulge in the joy of not fasting. Right. So that was the first one. The second one was creating and closing distance, right? So this was something that I talked with my students a lot about in kind of the lockdown space, where we really just jumped into innovating. So one of my greatest joys in working on the East Coast at that point, well, in general, was that we just really flew under the radar. We're kind of like on the edge of the map, and I felt like I could do... This is going to sound bad, but like I could kind of do whatever I wanted with the students. Not in a bad way, but just like we didn't have a huge audience or a huge like following to worry about. And so during COVID, we really tried to find ways to continue to do ministry on campus, which was obviously really hard because we couldn't actually be on campus.
Right.
And InterVarsity's whole philosophy is that your location is your mission field. So for students, like, your campus is your mission field. It's actually important that we not just invite Christians to come and huddle and find a safe space, but actually that we're sharing the gospel in a way that blesses campus. So we tried Zoom Bible studies. We tried doing things on Instagram that were less like just putting content out and had more of like an intentionality behind them. So thinking about our content ahead of time. So for example, like, we had a justice Bible study that was going on before the lockdown had started, and we wanted to keep that going.
Right.
So started thinking about, like, okay, how do we create content that allows us to have this conversation,
Right.
And in some ways allows us to display the conversations that we're having as a core team or as a leadership team.
Yeah.
And then offers ways for other people to engage in that as well. So there was a lot of innovation that was happening. One of the things that we would talk about is, like, what of the things that we're coming up with are closing space and what is creating space. So something that struck me is during the lockdown, it didn't really matter if you were in Halifax or in Toronto or in India or in the UK. You were equally far and equally close. Like, I probably talked to my cousins overseas more in those first 6 months than I have in the whole rest of my life on the phone, right? Yeah. Because I could talk to my cousin in Poland as easily as I could talk to my neighbor in Halifax.
Right.
And that was essentially down to the technology that we had. Right? Like, speaking of what was, like, I remember as a kid talking to my grandma in India and having to yell into the phone because the connection was so bad. This is like a landline, right? And then the call just, like, dropping. Being like, oh, okay, let's try calling again. And having to watch the time because you're paying for long distance and all of that kind of stuff. And now I can just get on WhatsApp and do a video call with my aunt or my cousin or whoever. So I think that is a really special way that technology has allowed us to close distance, to close really significant distance. The other kind of distance that we would talk about is, like, how do we help close distance between people and God? So for someone who maybe is not a Christian, maybe hasn't heard the gospel, maybe doesn't know what Christianity is about or what Jesus has to do with anything in their lives, how do we help close that gap, whether it's a knowledge gap or an experiential gap? How do we help give them a sense of who Jesus is and why he matters in their lives? And yeah, sometimes that comes in the form of Christian content. Sometimes that comes in the form of, like, paying attention to messages on a post that you've made and finding a prayerful way to respond rather than, like, a knee-jerk or reflexive way of responding. Sometimes that's reaching out to people in personal messages or, like, sliding into their DMs, as the kids would say. But, like, to speak a word of encouragement, right? The reality is there are also things that create distance in the ways we use technology. So are you using technology as a replacement for something that could be done in person or should be done in person? This was post-COVID, but I got, like, stood up by a guy on text and I was like, nope. I called him. I was like, nope, you should have done that in person. Right? So, like, that's a very particular example of creating distance. But I think for us, we realized that Zoom Bible studies were not it for the student population. My mom, as I mentioned, is elderly, and she's part of a Zoom Bible study every week. And all of the people on that are people who are elderly and have mobility issues. So it's phenomenal for them.
It's meeting that, yeah.
It's really meeting a need for them. It's closing a distance that they physically would not be able to cover if it weren't for that option.
Yeah.
But for students, like Zoom Bible studies were exhausting.
Yeah.
And still are, and it's impossible to get commitment. And the general consensus is like, this is something that creates relational distance for people. And creates emotional distance from the experience, creates even distance from God in some ways, because they're not able to engage in the text in a way that is meaningful or draws them near to the Spirit. So that's closing and creating distance. The embodiment piece, I think, really comes down to recognizing that we are embodied beings no matter where we are. So we have this tendency to talk about the virtual world as sort of a pocket dimension that isn't real life. We'll even say that, right? We'll talk about like your life online and then your real life. As if this isn't real. The stuff that you're doing online, who you are online isn't real. And I actually think that's really dangerous for our discipleship. Because the more you view that space as disembodied, the less sovereignty Jesus has over it. The less your discipleship matters, the less you're aware of how it's forming your spirit. And that happens like even in our bodies, right? Like our posture changes, right? Like there's ways that our bodies are necessarily involved in all of the things that we're doing, even if those things feel cerebral or feel ethereal. They're not entirely, because we are never disembodied beings. We are always embodied. So I think in some ways I like to challenge the idea that this is not embodied community. And I understand what people mean when they say it's not embodied. But again, like we have a different experience of embodied versus disembodied that a lot of younger people don't have. They don't experience the like distinct line between this part of life and this other part of life. That's I've heard the term like digitalization is like this idea of like this where that line between like physical world that we're living in and the digital world that's becoming more and more blurred. Totally.
And it's a silly example, and I want to we'll have to wrap up here shortly, but there's something called parasocial relationships. And so I listen to a podcast. It's a football podcast. Whatever. I listened to it for a couple of years, and initially there were like these 4 guys who were hosting it. And one of the hosts he passed away from cancer. And so it was a big thing on the pod, obviously because these guys are like really close friends and all this stuff. But I was it was a funny response. In one of the a couple of the ones surrounding his passing. I was emotional, and I'm I've never met this person. They're talking about football, and of course it's sad just because loss of human life. But there was a deeper connection there, And that's just listening to a podcast as I'm driving home from work. But
you feel like you've gotten to know these people because in a way you have. Right. And it's not bi-directional in the way that this relationship is, but they have chosen to put pieces of themselves out there for other people to engage with. And you were one of those people. So week after week, you engaged with real pieces of real humans. So when those people are affected negatively, when one of them passes away, of course that's going to have an impact on you because it's not that wasn't real. It's different from this, but it's not fake.
Which I think is every time we think about coming back to the context of the church, and that's how do we create those spaces where those human interactions can happen, and ideally fostering spaces where then people can encounter Jesus in some way in those spaces. We'll conclude our time, and I really appreciate this, and I appreciate I think the thing I really appreciate about you, Sanjana, is you're thoughtful in what you you're just thoughtful, wise.
Thanks.
But also you're not. It's a critical engagement. I'm willing to ask these questions and then be able to fill this out. And I really appreciate that you're willing to bring us into that and offer it to us, because I think there's some real hope there, and also like opportunities for us as ministry leaders and whatever context we're in at whatever age and stage we're in, to be able to think about these type of things. So yeah, I don't know if there's any kind of concluding thoughts that you would want to offer, but
sure. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. I think we were talking earlier about how like we're all constantly learners, and I think I appreciate any opportunity to discuss with people, so that it's not just like me stewing in my own thoughts about things.
I get that.
That would be very unhealthy. But yeah, I think the thing that I've recognized that hopefully is encouraging for people who are leading in the church is that young people are really hungry for discipleship in this in particular. I was recently speaking to a group of like 18, 19-year-olds, and one of the young women mentioned like, oh, the primary emotion that I feel when I pick up my phone is shame. And that just broke my heart, because I think of like how many times per day this young woman experiences profound shame that is instinctual at this point. And it's not because she's doing anything wrong. It's just because she's been told so often that this thing that is ubiquitous to contemporary life is inherently evil, is inherently wrong, is irredeemable, that we should all get away from it. And I don't think that's God's heart for her. So I think I do approach this from a really hopeful perspective of like, I think the church will be able to navigate this shift in culture. I think at the cusp of any major shift, it has always felt like the end is nigh.
Right, yeah.
But I think like God is good, and our legacy as the church, though imperfect, has always been to figure out what it means to follow Jesus well in the challenges that exist around us. So I think maybe I'll just end on a word of encouragement that it's not impossible. I think it will be difficult, and we need to be thoughtful. But I think if we can be reminded of and remind each other of the hope that we have in Christ, that actually like he will teach us how to be wise with this technology, that he will continue to be faithful even in the midst of that particular change as well, that he wants to meet people still, that he's like still in the work of transformation and sanctification and just of being near and drawing near to his creation, that I think we'll be fine.
Oh, I love the idea of ending on that. And like we saw in COVID, people respond.
Yeah.
So we can do it. Thank you.